Good morning. We're continuing our 3-week sermon series called Truth, Justice, and the American Way. Last week we talked about truth, divine truth. This week we're talking about justice. And thought I'd tell you about a time when I was living in a town. We were renting a townhouse, my wife and I, before we had kids. And we had the townhouse, we were in Annapolis. We lived in Annapolis, and we had the townhouse that was not the end unit. That means we had one in the middle. So anybody lived in a middle townhouse before, and you can hear the noise coming from both neighbors at times. So one night I woke up in the middle, and it was a Saturday night going into Sunday morning, and you all know what I do on Sunday morning. I get up early on Sunday morning, one of the only cars on the road on Sunday morning. And about 3 a.m. that night, I was awoken, and I could hear this like thumping noise in the neighbor next door. And I put my hand on the wall, and I could feel the vibrations of the bass through the stereo system just thumping away at our next door neighbor. So I tried to, go back to sleep, put it out of my mind, all those great techniques that you try, to no avail. I still can't get back to sleep, and I got to get up early. I got to preach a sermon. So I'm starting to get frustrated, so I decide I'm going to get up, go talk to the neighbor. So I put my clothes on, go downstairs, go out around, knock on the door, and I'll never forget the image of the young couple that was living next to us. The guy came to the door, and he opened up the door, and I just looked in, and there was like this, it was just all dark. All the lights were out, and there were all these people in there, and the music stereo was thumping, and this wave of smoke just hit me in the face. And it was an illegal smell to it as it came out. And I'm like, hey, can you turn down the stereo system? He's like, oh, I'm so sorry, man. Yeah. And he tells somebody to turn down the stereo, and he's like, oh, I'm so sorry. He's very apologetic, and he's like, we'll keep it down, we'll keep it calm, and I'm thinking, yeah, you don't want me to call the police. I got that. So I said, good night, and he turned the stereo, and it got quiet, and I went back. I was able to go back to bed and so forth. But I think about that, and I think about, as we talk about this idea, that there's sometimes that I wonder what people are smoking in our society, in our culture. That sometimes I think to myself, what are people smoking? Because when we smoke something, when we get high on something, it doesn't have to be illegal, we become oblivious to the needs of people around us. And that's why injustice prevails. Injustice happens when we get so caught up in what we're high on that we forget about the needs of others. We become oblivious to the needs of the people around us, and that creates an environment for injustice to happen. Let me give you an example. As you know, I've been advocating for affordable housing in Howard County. It's getting harder and harder to afford to live here for all of us. It's very difficult to live here, and if you're a young person, young family, trying to make a way in Howard County, you know how expensive it is to rent just a townhouse or an apartment. So you think about this. So I've been advocating for affordable housing, not just for our teachers or firefighters, our police officers, because they have to live outside of our county and then work in our county because they can't afford to live here. But I'm also have been advocating for the working class poor, the people who work hard, 2-3 jobs to get by and can't afford a rent in a 1-bedroom apartment in Howard County. And they're trying to raise a family just like you and I. They're trying to have a living just like you and I. And so there's this affordable housing issue that we wrestle with as a county. And so as I've advocated for it, and as I've talked in different groups and heard, and a lot of times I'm listening or I serve on some boards and committees in the county on behalf of the church and outside the church, I've heard some people say some things. And every time I hear it, I go, what are they smoking? I was in a meeting with some citizens in Columbia. They were concerned that they were bringing affordable housing to the downtown Columbia area. And so the citizens were concerned. And so I'm going to share some of the comments that I've heard along the way. And now I will put this disclaimer on them. This is my recollection. I don't know, these aren't word for word quotes, but what I recall, what I heard. So does that make sense? So, because I know I say things all the time and people don't recollect it exactly correct, but yeah, you can laugh at that. I preach it every week, and I go, that's not exactly what But here's what I recollect from one meeting. I was in a meeting with downtown Columbia, and someone said something to this effect: we don't want those types of people living next door to us. assuming that people of lower socioeconomic class, right, somehow were going to bring negative behaviors into the community. That was an assumption, right? Because, they were worried about that. That was a fear that they had, and so they were wrestling with that. And so I understood the fear, but at the same time, I kind of said, what have you been smoking? I was in a meeting talking about our cold weather shelter, and we were talking about the issue of affordable housing. We had a councilwoman there from the Howard County Council. She was talking about affordable housing, and I was sitting in the meeting, and someone was angry with the council person and said this to the group. This was in a Leadership Howard County meeting, so one of our county leaders says, people need to work and earn their way into affordable housing just like everybody else. If they can't, then they need to live somewhere else. Which means that if you can't make as much money as me, you need to go live in someplace else. That's called socioeconomic segregation. So that was a comment, and I thought, what is he smoking? And then I was in a meeting with the Hughes Corporation just recently, and this has really been wrestling with it. And I was sitting in this meeting, and I was really restless because I was the only one in this meeting as Hughes Corporation was presenting its plan for an upscale downtown Columbia plan, and they were putting this plan together, and they were presenting and selling it to us and asking for us to give them a tax break, 30-year tax break, so they don't have to pay taxes for 30 years so they can do their project. So they're saying we can't afford to do our project without this tax break, so please give us a tax break so that we can build the project. Now, I could read between the lines, and I won't tell you what I was reading. But I was the only one in the meeting asking questions. Everybody was like, this is a great idea. And I'm sitting there going, what are these people smoking? Because this is one of the comments of the staff from the Hughes Corporation. They said, we need upscale stores, not a Walmart culture in downtown Columbia, so business can get done. People don't want to do business unless it's upscale. Which says, what does that mean, Walmart culture? What did he mean by that? Was he talking about a different socioeconomic class of people that we don't want doing business in our community? I don't know. It's a question, right? That didn't want to get answered. Folks, I could say that you and I probably had very similar thoughts as well, right? As we live in Howard County, I am blessed to live in this county, to be able to live in a nice house, in a nice neighborhood, and for my kids to go to nice schools. But at times, I walk around our county sometimes and I wonder, what are people smoking? I think what people are smoking is something called classism. You know what classism is? Classism is this. This is what classism is. We have a definition for you up on the screen. Prejudice against or in favor of people belonging to a particular social class, or socioeconomic social class, or upscale versus low scale, or whatever you want to call it. But whenever we start to think that way, we're actually practicing and thinking classism, thinking that this group deserves more favor than this group, or we have prejudice against this group over this group. Whenever we start to do that, we begin to practice classism. It's also the same with racism, which also is happening in our communities. So I thought about, Rouse, who was the visionary for Columbia. You know what his vision for Columbia was? His vision was that it would be a community where people of all backgrounds, all nationalities, all ethnicities, all races, all socioeconomic classes could live together in the same community. Because he saw the value, that's what it took to create a healthy community. That we needed to hear from everybody. We need to be with everybody. That this was also in my position as a pastor, that also was part of what God's vision for heaven is. When you look at the vision of heaven in the New Testament, it's a people of all races, all nationalities, all socioeconomic backgrounds coming together in one community. That's what I also love about the church. The church is great because people of all socioeconomic backgrounds, all races, all places, all nationalities come together in one single purpose. That's what's great about the church. That's what's great about being in community. There was another person who had a vision for his country, and he wrote this in his book, his autobiography. He said this, by means of shrewd lies, unremittingly repeated, it is possible to make people believe that heaven is hell and hell heaven. Adolf Hitler. He got people smoking something in Germany, which focused them on themselves and the greatness of Germany. That's what he sold there. His vision was sold on the greatness of Germany, making Germany great and wonderful and this great place. So he got them to focus on themselves so that to make them oblivious to what else the other people around them, right? The needs of the others around them. He got them smoking something. Now, it's interesting because he wrote that in his book that sold over 1 million copies in Germany. So this was before he was even Chancellor of Germany, before he even rose to power. People knew that this was his philosophy. This was his approach to what was going on, right? So I think about that. That actually creates the possibility for injustice to happen in their country. So I want you to think about this. How many people have ever been to a house of mirrors or a maze of mirrors? At the carnival, at the, wherever you've gone in there, right? And when you go into a house of mirrors, what do you see as you go through it? What do you see? Yourself, right? See, maybe what we're high on is what's good for me, right? Maybe we get high on ourselves. Maybe we listen to the voices that tell us to focus on ourselves, to take care of ourselves, to benefit ourselves, to do what's great for us, to do what's best for us, not realizing that sometimes we become oblivious to the needs of the other people around us. We become oblivious to the fact that there are people around us who are hurting. And it's that environment which creates the environment for injustice to happen when we start to segregate and we start to do these things. So there's a divine truth that's missing. We talked about truth last week and having divine truth. There's a divine truth here that we need to grab onto and we need to remind ourselves of if we're going to create an environment for justice rather than injustice. And this divine truth is the founding of our country. And this divine truth is found in the scriptures. And this divine truth is this: all people are created in the image of God. You are created in the image of God. You matter to God. You have value. You have worth because you are created. As soon as you start to take that divine truth away from a society, from a person, from any community, you start to create an environment for injustice. As soon as you take people's worth and value away from them, then you can start to make lists of who's more important than who. And you can practice classism, racism, all kinds of things. Because they're no longer of equal worth anymore, right? And then if you go to the Holocaust Museum, you can see the list of people in Germany. They had a list and who was worth more than who. Which class of citizen was more valuable than another. Because why? Because they removed this divine truth from their society. And whenever a society or culture removes this truth, it does that. Now, our founding fathers wanted to make sure that we were a nation that kept hold of this truth. They put it right in the Declaration of Independence. It says at the beginning, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men, women, people are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? We all know that. Martin Luther King said something very similar. Martin Luther King said this: a just law, in fact, let me just back up. He says this before I read the quote. He was writing a letter while he was in jail in Birmingham. This is a letter from a Birmingham jail. He wrote this, and he wrote this to the church. He wrote this to the clergy who were saying to him, hey, Martin, tone it down. You're being too aggressive. You're being too outspoken. You need to calm down. And he wrote this, and he says, a just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God. Any law that uplifts human personality is just, and any law that degrades human personality is unjust. Segregation distorts the soul. The soul, the image of God. The founding fathers had this truth. Martin Luther King was reminding our nation of this truth, because it's one thing to have a truth but not apply it, right? And that's what Martin Luther King was saying. He's like, we've got this truth, but we're not applying it in our society. We're not creating just laws. And so we need to bring justice back into our nation, because justice is always rooted in this theological truth, in this divine truth that all of us have value and worth. Do you know that today? Do you believe that you are a person of value and worth because you have a Creator? God created you. You're a masterpiece. And God's still working on it. I know it's not a perfect masterpiece. I'm not a perfect masterpiece, but God's working on it. And if you heard the scriptures read this morning, you heard something about justice. The biblical view of justice is that justice is blind to status, to class. It is blind. When you read the Exodus, we heard the Exodus text, notice that it said you were supposed to do the right thing regardless of a person's socioeconomic status. You and I are to do the right thing even if it's a person we don't like. Even if it's our enemy, we're supposed to do the right thing. We're supposed to act justly even if it's our enemy that we're doing the right thing for. Jesus picks up on this in the New Testament. But that's what justice is. It's blind, and that's why our statues of justice have a blindfold in our nation. Amos was saying the same thing. Amos was speaking to a people who were living very luxuriously and going to worship and doing these great offerings because of their wealth, but they were neglecting the poor in their midst. And they were getting high on some other things in their worship that were focusing themselves rather than on justice and on the needs of others around them. Same thing Amos was saying. That's why Amos was saying as a prophet, he says, look, God's not paying any attention to your worship because you're not doing anything right in your world. You're not acting justly in your world. So he said, and Martin Luther King quoted the prophet often, he said, but let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream. You hear that? Justice is to never stop flowing. Never stop flowing. Amos knew this. Amos was a shepherd. And when Amos took his sheep out into the arid region, the desert region where he was always concerned about where he was going to find water, right? As a shepherd, he wanted to take his sheep where there's water. And there would be times when he would get to a place where there was water a week ago or 2 weeks ago, and there was no water there. And it was frustrating for him as a shepherd when he would take the sheep to the watering hole and there was no water. And then he'd have to go to another place and travel even further. And then he'd get there and he'd hope there'd be water there. And maybe there wasn't any water. He longed for a river that would just never stop flowing, right? He always knew it was going to be there. He could depend upon it to take his sheep to it, and it would always be flowing. There would always be water there. He wanted a place for the people, all people, not just the wealthy people, to have a place to go to always get justice. Can you imagine what it would be like to go to a place to get water and it's dried up? Then you go to another place to get water and it's not there. And then you go to another place to get water and it's still not there. How would you feel at that point? Frustrated, right? Upset. You're actually now in crisis mode because you depend on water to live, to have life. And you're actually in crisis mode at this point because it's life or death at this point. And so you start to cry out and you start to complain and you start to get frustrated because there's no water. If justice is to be an ever-flowing, never-failing stream. See, part of what's happening in our culture, right, is if you keep going to get justice and it's not there and you don't get it, and then you go again to get justice and it's not there and you don't get it, and you go again to get justice and it's not there and you don't get it, how frustrated do you get? How much of a crisis do you become involved in? That's why our nation is in a crisis. Because not everybody is getting justice, and we've stopped the stream. And I think part of the stream that stops is this. This is my interpretation of our society and our culture. What's happening is that the people who have a lot of money, that's where justice stops. Classism. And the people who don't have as much money, justice doesn't seem to flow down to them because they don't have the means to work the system. And so the system is stopped up that way. And in the New Testament, we're called there's something else that we're called to do as Christians that's never to fail. Do you know what's never to fail? Not only is justice to never fail, but love's never to fail. It says in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, love never fails. Our compassion for other people is never to fail. And so we can't get caught up in what everybody else is getting high on if we're going to create an environment for justice to happen in our society. We've got to stop smoking what everybody else is smoking. and we've got to start loving people. I've found that a lot of people in the church have quoted me this quote very often throughout the years, have said, God helps those who help themselves. Anybody ever said that? I've said it. Not in the Bible. Benjamin Franklin said that. And we have often quoted it, but that's not the biblical message at all. The biblical message is God helps those who can't help themselves. Parable of the Good Samaritan. The Good Samaritan helped the man who could not help himself. He was broken down by the side of the road. He couldn't help himself. Blind Bartimaeus, laying by the gate of the city, could not help himself. Jesus healed him. Jesus loved somebody who could not help themselves, took care of somebody who could not help themselves. 4 friends brought another friend who was a paralytic and brought him on a mat to Jesus. They helped someone who could not help themselves, who could not physically move towards Jesus. They brought him to Jesus, and Jesus helped him and healed him. God helps those who cannot help themselves, not the other way around. And that's why justice is called for, to be advocates for justice. So I thought, we need another image rather than the house of mirrors. I was thinking about this, and I'm thinking, I feel like I often live in this house of mirrors. It's always saying, a society and culture saying, hey, pay attention to Matt. And I've got to shatter those mirrors. And I've got to get out something. I got to use a whole nother way of seeing things. I would call it, what I had a couple weeks ago, I went to the doctor, and they hooked me up to an EKG. When you get older, they start doing more tests to you. I don't know why they do that. But they start making you do more tests, and they put me on an EKG. And the doctor saw something on the EKG, and he said, well, we need to send you for an echocardiogram, which is a sonogram of your heart. And so I went. This is not my heart. This is just something off the internet. Sorry. And so I laid there on the table. The technician took this sonogram machine and gelled me up, and they were looking for my heart. And they found my heart, by the way. And I said, can you send that report to my wife, because I have a heart. And she looked at me and said, oh, I've never heard that before. So they're looking for my heart. They find my heart, and I have this heart, and it's beating, and it's good, and everything's fine. Doctor just want to check it out. Everything's good. And so they get this picture of my heart, and I thought, that's more what we need. We need more sonogram technicians as we look at the world, who take a sonogram and look beneath the surface and look for the heart of people. Because here's the thing, everybody has the same heart. It beats. It loves, it cries, it hurts, it has joys. Everybody, regardless of their status. And we need people who will look more like into people's lives like sonograms and look for the image of God in other people. To see beyond the surface of things, to see beyond what the media is saying, to see beyond what everything else is being told us, and look into the life of somebody. And the only way to do that sonogram is to get to know somebody, whoever it is. Look deeper for the image of God in them and see that they have worth and value instead of me, me, me. And Martin Luther King preached a sermon, and he says, we need people with a tough mind and a tender heart. I think today we still need people with a tough mind and a tender heart. A tough mind who says, I'm not going to smoke what everybody else is smoking. And I'm going to be an advocate for other people who can't be at the table. That's what I was doing as I go to these meetings. I'm advocating for other people who can't be at the table. I'm simply at the table because of who my position in this community. But there are other people who cannot be at the table, who aren't invited to the table because they're at a different station in life. So who's going to advocate for them at the table? Who's going to speak up for them at the table? Got to have a tough mind to do that. You have to walk into a corporation meeting and say, I got some questions. But you also need a tender heart. A heart of compassion, a heart of love that never fails, a heart that is unconditional to everybody. Amen? Amen.